The first speaker today is Narayan. We're going to speak about the link between energy and information for the design of neuromorphic.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Wolfgang for inviting me to this forum. I've learned a lot listening to all of you the last few days. And so what I want to talk about today is, so I'm basically a neuromorphic engineer. So what does that mean? I'll tell you about it a little bit. I am the CTO of this new company called Eta Compute. So Eta, as you know, is a Greek letter for efficiency. So as an engineer, efficient compute is what we're trying to do. So Eta Compute, that's the origin of the words. And what we're trying to do is address a problem that is, I think, potentially has some benefits when you try to learn from the neuroscience literature and try to apply or transfer knowledge, if you will, into something that's going to be real and practical. So I'll tell you about the problem, but before that, let's look at this basic idea is that there are devices that we all use, cell phones, smart watches, and so on, that are just exploding in terms of the number of these devices everybody has. People have more than one cell phone, et cetera, et cetera. So these are edge devices because they directly interact and communicate with other machines, objects, and so on. It's estimated there's going to be about 50 billion of these guys by 2020. So when we talk about 50 billion, I'm talking about agriculture, radiation, mining. You just expand the scope of all the devices that are there. It's huge. It's a potentially huge, set of devices. So the question is, if these devices are involved in the so-called, let's say, sense, infer, act loop, which is because they directly interact with the environment, that if they can sense, infer, and act, that's the fastest loop you can get in terms of the device and the productivity or the efficiency of the device. But typically, what we have today is this cloud model, where you have a cloud computing system that actually does the knowledge extraction from the data that's sent up, and then it percolates down into the device, and then it's an incarnation of the particular implementation, and then it runs, and then there's some changes. You've got to go back to the cloud. And so cloud is more powerful, but then it's slow. So the question is, what can we do about this agility requirement at the edge in order to enable all these devices to be, in quote, intelligent, right? Well, I mean, if you look at, so what we are trying to do as a company is look at addressing several issues that, as a company, we talked to a lot of, vendors and people who are interested in solving problems. And for them, these are all some of the laundry list of things that they worry about. So you have data volume, meaning that, if a car, we're talking about autonomous cars today, 4 terabytes an hour, roughly is what the number is. And if all the cars in the world have these, you can imagine the data volume that you're generating there. How do you deal with that? What can you do about it? Do you have to go to the cloud every single instance of the data that is sampled, or is there any way to deal with all this? What's going on there? What can we do there? Energy, of course. I mean, you have a cell phone, you have limited battery, you have very little energy, and so what can you do there? Privacy is an important requirement, seems like. So people, for example, there's this thing about somebody looking at you or monitoring you all the time when you talk to your Amazon Echo or the devices like that. Security, there's actually a demonstration that happened recently in California where people were able to remotely log into a car's computer and apply the brakes or control the car basically remotely. So they could break in basically. And so if you think of a car as an edge device, then that's an issue, security. And then these other things, for example, latency, virtual reality is an issue where if you have a visual latency in the signals that are coming in, you're going to have a big problem. You're going to have, your head is start going to spin because of the latency problem. So these are all issues, and so people are interested in addressing this at the edge. So what are we doing about it? I'll talk, first I'll go into a little bit of neuroscience. You're all experts, but I just want to sort of compile a list of thoughts. And then in the end, I'll show you a demonstration of the chip that we have today that does, the basic, sort of shows you the basic principles of how it works. So the first point I want to make is about neuromorphic systems and computing in general. So this was originally coined by, originally it was called neuromorphic electronics to basically describe analog circuits that mimic neurobiological architecture and circuits in the nervous system. So basically, this was way back in the 80s, mid-80s. Carver-Mead had a huge NSF center, out of which came a whole legion of neuromorphic professors, if you will, that are all over the world now. But today, neuromorphic engineering/computing is what it's known for. Is basically they've expanded the scope from just being analog circuits to being everything in the world of electronics, including software systems. So digital mixed mode, analog VLSI, and software systems. So that's what I mean by when I say neuromorphic computing. And so now I'm going to get into this idea of the idea that brain evolved over millions of years, and the constraints that it actually evolved based on was actually very simple. It seems like it's a very simple idea of benefit and cost. So what I mean by that is you have this selective pressure that says, well, we have to generate adaptive behavior via information processing under changing conditions, right? So that's the benefit. But then that comes with the cost. You have to minimize the energy consumed during the process. So it's sort of like a yin and yang of the equation here. That energy and information seems to be sort of butting against each other. And if you can solve this problem or sort of figure out how evolution has solved this problem at various scales, and the brain that we see today seems to reflect some of those choices that were made over millions of years, maybe suggestive of how we could design neuromorphic systems that could be interesting. So if you look at, so I'm going to talk about a compilation of work that has been done by others, but sort of try to make my point about this link between energy and information first. So the nervous system, as you all know very well, consumes 20% of the energy for just 2% of the body mass. But then bulk of this energy is for action potential generation, its maintenance, and the signal transmission through the synapse. So if you look at it from an engineering point of view, you're talking about bandwidth, noise, and propagation are the three features that we care about in this particular process here. And bandwidth means signaling speed, noise is signal quality, and propagation is basically signal transmission. So if you think about the mode in which these neurons communicate, it seems like this classic information theory thing where if it seems like action potentials are the way, and so if a neuron doesn't spike at all, there is no information. If it spikes all the time, there is no information. So there's this happy medium somewhere in between where there is information, and information here is in the sense of Shannon. The quantities that we care about here was actually measured for the spike timing is actually measured by a beautiful experiment in Princeton by Strong et al. In 1998. So they measured the I wouldn't be able to say this properly. I'm not a neuroscientist, but in the motion area, they stimulated a neuron or a set of neurons with a signal like you see on the top there, top left. And then they measured or recorded the activity of some neurons in that area as a function of time. And they wanted to measure both the signal entropy and the noise entropy from the data. And so for those who don't know, so signal entropy means you sort of send a long stimuli and measure the entropy of that signal by looking at windows of time, the width of the windows, various widths of the windows, and you look for h of s, which is entropy for information. And then similarly, you do that for noise, meaning that you present the signal over and over again, and you measure the variance or the noise, and then you subtract the two, you get information. And the ratio of the information to the spike entropy would be the efficiency. So what they found is basically that here the plot shows information rate on the y-axis and entropy rate on the x-axis. For smaller and smaller windows, the information rate produced was much better. So the tighter the window, the more information rates were achieved. You can sort of think of it more along the lines of that curve there. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean just 1 millisecond, but it would be a small window within which the spikes that appear are much more informative than not. And then if you look at neural morphology, if you look at the size and distribution of the axonal tracts and the neurons themselves, it seems to suggest that evolution has also tried to balance these two, information rate versus efficiency. So in this plot here, it seems to suggest that the smaller the neurons, the lower the information rate, but then it's much better in terms of efficiency. So the complexity in the neuron has got to be traded off with the efficiency, and so there's a distribution of these neurons found in biology that allows you to make the trade-off. And then not only that, you have the distribution of the axonal tracks that are skewed more towards thin axons. So most of the axons that you find are skewed towards thin axons, and furthermore, thin axons have lower firing rates than thicker ones. So, suggesting that there's a bias there again, or sort of a trade-off that was sort of evolved over time to have this sort of a distribution. And then if you look at at a larger scale, the cortex level or the whole brain, there seems to be this balance between dense, short, and sparse long-range connectivity to enable efficient behavior. So dense, short range would basically extract information from the environment, but then in order to generate a system-level behavior, you need to integrate all this information. So there are thicker, longer axons spread among these thinner, lower information rate axons that integrate all the information, and then also solve this problem of synaptic path length, where a neuron in one area of the brain, prefrontal, say, to the occipital lobe, can be rapid, so that the information exchange is also pretty good. So a bunch of problems there that are solved by balancing these two. Then if you look at the neurons itself in more detail, the channel properties, the voltage-gated channels, for example, control the threshold. Threshold obviously means the lower the threshold, the higher the spike rate, which means higher information rate, and so there's more energy consumed and so on. So all these different evolutionary features that showed up sort of balances these two at the lowest of lower denominations, or if you want to call it the cellular level. Similarly, the neurons are never allowed to spike. I mean, there's a regulation of its own firing rate, self-regulation of its own firing rate, in order to keep the information rate in a more balanced state. And also, there seems to be new data suggesting that the myelination of the axonal tracks also controls, basically the information rate that is transferred per joule. This is work by Fields in 2015. Going on, if you look at the biophysics now of the transmission of the synaptic action potential through the synapse into the postsynaptic side, if you define two terms like probability of the vesicle release onto the postsynaptic cell as P, and the probability of the presynaptic spike occurrence as S, then you can sort of see a beautiful work by Harris et al. Shows how these two are related in controlling information rates. So for example, the top plot on this shows that the fraction of information transmitted is linearly varies with S, which meaning that if the presynaptic neuron doesn't spike a lot, meaning S is very small, then the release with more release probability, it grows linearly. But then it's sublinear or depressive in a way for S's that are much bigger on average. And then, but then if you look at the information to energy ratio, it seems like across release probabilities for a smaller S, it's much better comparatively speaking. So which means that it's biased towards spiking less or picking or wanting to be in a regime where it doesn't spike too much, so that the presynaptic probability of release, the S probability is much smaller, and so it's going to be sort of preferential to that, so to keep this balance. And then if you look at the circuits themselves, in the cortical circuits themselves, we all know it's a bunch of excitatory inhibitory neurons tightly coupled. And if you zoom into any one of them, it's sort of a ratio of 80-20 roughly, excitatory to inhibitory neurons connected all which ways. And subtle changes in the gains of the synapses could really alter the dynamics of the circuits. But the key thing is, it seems like there is an option here again in terms of keeping the activity balanced. So there's this balanced current regime. This beautiful data by Sengupta et al. Talks about how information per spike is much higher for balanced current regimes, as opposed to the other two where you just have excitation or just balanced conductance. And the same deal with the efficiency. So it seems like these systems are again calibrated to sort of balance to promote efficiency at the level of circuits. Then going into the synapse in terms of plasticity, it seems like there's an optimal filtering of information happening there for efficient transfer of information. So we all know some data from Markram and others that have showed how the spikes can sort of, the ordering of the spikes can change the gain on the synapse. There's short-term plasticity that regulates information rates by lowering energy. And also, of course, there is this growth of spines on these dendrites and to affect information transfer in various which ways. And last but not least, neuromodulation, which allows you to sort of optimally filter at a different time scale than probably at the synapse in terms of spike timing dependent plasticity. This is a citation of Sophie's work, which I really I've been trying to leverage, which is basically at the population level. Seems like the same principles apply, where you have to balance between excitation and inhibition in populations of neurons to enable efficient information coding. And then this idea that David Cox talked about, this predictive coding, where the lower levels encode information, redundant information, so that the higher levels have energy savings, because spikes don't transmit much up in the higher levels if the lower levels are good at predicting what's going on. So these kinds of designs or things that appear in biology holds relevance for how you may want to architect a neuromorphic system. And the last, but one of the big things that I find is this idea of asynchrony. So, we all know that the brain is asynchronous. What I mean by that is many clocks or rhythms, not just one particular, mode of it. And this just-in-time mode of operation, it seems to have a big deal in terms of its efficiency. I'll talk about that from a hardware side of why that is. Complex operations, for example, can take more time than average, but simple ones can just take less time. And the brain doesn't have to consume energy just waiting for the other complex one to be done. And actions can start as soon as possible, depending on what ends up happening in terms of the complexity. So if you think about a summary of these kinds of ideas, if you put them together, there is, from the information coding point of view, there's control of biophysics and there's encoding strategies. If you just look at these two, what you want is you want to make the signals in a neuromorphic system energetically cheap. Whatever means to do that, if possible, should be done. And there are many ideas out there. There's not just one design. There are many different architectures and ideas out there that have been pursued. But seems like this event-driven or asynchronous mode of sending the signals out makes a lot of sense from the hardware point of view. If you can actually mix that with low voltage circuits as well as analog circuits in computing or extracting information and passing it on, it seems like a good idea at least. So from the encoding side, what we're talking about is circuits that require fewer signals to carry information. So not just to generate the signal cheaply, but also to the number of these signals that need to be transmitted in order to send useful information is at the other side. So there, it's about the design of the system itself, how you architect them, how are these modules connected together, is the connectivity programmable, what kinds of densities can we realize with technologies that are there today that allows us to satisfy some of the requirements here, is some of the things that we look at and study. So what I want to shift here to is basically the things that we're doing at Eta Compute to address some of these things. So the first thing we realized, based on what, so I've been doing this for more than a decade now, was lead for a project at Hughes Research Labs on a DARPA program called Synapse, where we actually built a small chip that actually can learn on the chip, demonstrating using spike timing, dependent plasticity, and other features there. But what seems to be the most important for hardware, at least if you want to realize or draw inspiration from biology, is this idea of asynchrony. And being able to do that in a delay-insensitive way. If you can have a hardware design that's delay-insensitive, meaning that these modules are basically communicating without a clock, and they handshake. They have to handshake. And if there is no delay in that process, if you can minimize that delay and design hardware that does that, then there's a whole laundry list of advantages that we can sort of leverage. So for example, low power consumption comes in because if you're doing fine-grained clock gating and there's basically at standby situations, there's no power consumed really. You can sort of control the operating speed. We have some interesting features I'll talk about there that determine the local latency is not really controlled by this global clock, which is actually a big issue with synchronous systems. Most of our systems are synchronous, and the computers we have today are synchronous. It's robust to variations in supply voltage, temperature, and fabrication. For those who actually build chips, these are big things. I mean, you really cannot, design circuits that are sensitive to these because they're not scalable really. So analog systems in general, if you just build pure analog, which is what Carver Mead originally was proposing, was going to be a big problem because of this reason. And then formally verifiable. That is, you want to leverage the tools that are there today to build these chips rather than have your own custom tools and then have that be integrated with the current tools. And it's a big headache. And so trying to build a chip with all these disparate tools is a major problem. And we actually can show that we are formally verifiable in the sense that any synchronous circuit you build, we can actually show an equivalent asynchronous circuit functionally, timing-wise, behaviorally accurate. So that makes it it's a very interesting feature. And then what we've done is basically, in order to leverage compute, what we've done is we just took ARM M3, Cortex M3, and a DSP from NXP called NXP Cool Flux DSP, and put together an asynchronous core that basically interfaces in the real world using just the regular UART and the USB and so on interfaces. But then have the DSP, ADC, and the Cortex M3 completely asynchronous. So we have this technology to do that. This is the chip that actually is a 25 square centimeter chip. So the 4 panels you see here is a solar cells there that just runs on the solar cells. You can basically, for this particular chip that we are looking at for examples, we have 128 kilobytes of RAM, 512 kilobytes of flash. That's it. We can support up to 2,000 neurons and about 128,000 synapses. It runs at about 60 megahertz max speed, consuming just 2 milliwatts. And the other thing is we can actually dial up and down the voltage. So we can sort of go from 0.2 volts all the way to 1.2 volts. And by doing that, we can manage how much we want to trade off between speed and efficiency. So for example, if I want to run it really fast, I may require a higher voltage. But if I can keep it slow and low, which is typically what a spiking model typically operates about, maybe hundreds of kilohertz even, we get a huge bang for the buck. And then the other point is that we are currently focusing, as a small company we are about 25 engineers, not too much funding yet, but we're focusing only on 55 nanometers to keep our costs low as well. So these chips are 55 nanometer chips. And this plot here I just wanted to show you is we compare very favorably with any of the synchronous chips that you'll find out there. So the x-axis is basically the speed, y-axis is the power. And what you want to be is you want to consume, you want to go as fast as you can, but consume as little energy as you possibly can. And these are all commercially available chips against which we have benchmarked our chip. So we run at about 2 milliwatts for 60 plus megahertz. That's the rate. So 30 microwatts per megahertz, if you will. That's the rate at which we go. And it's actually mildly quadratic, this plot. So if I have a problem where I can just run at hundreds of kilohertz, I'm talking about microwatts as opposed to milliwatts even. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to leverage, so in this asynchronous mode of operation, we're trying to leverage spiking dynamics actually to run at low frequencies deliberately, because then we can exploit this low voltage operation. So I can run at 0.2 volts instead of 1.2 volts. And as we all know, square of the voltage is a direct correlate to the power. So the lower the voltage, I can get a much better bang for the buck, so to speak, in terms of efficiency. So that's what we're trying to do. And we have the cool thing about this is that the M3 is basically software programmable with high-level language. I don't really need a custom language or a particular set of tools to program this in. I can just use a traditional language, C++, for example, and I can just use this as a hypothesis testing machine. I can have all kinds of models, parameters, and dynamics. We have demonstrated already some applications that are very interesting. I'll show you 2 demos to conclude my talk, but then keyword spotting, continuous speech recognition in the voice domain, and then we're also starting to look at the image and health monitoring applications. So I will show you the first example would be this continuous speech recognition model. So what we did is Google has this data set called the Google Speech Command data set, which is compiled. It has about 2,300 speakers uttering 30 words. And so basically it's a bunch of data that's very useful for us to sort of calibrate and see where we are. What we can do is we can take the data and using a single pass through the data, meaning once I process the signal, I'll talk about that, and I just have to run one instance of each sample through the system. I can get up to 96% accuracy on a 10-digit problem and an 85% accuracy with the 30-word problem. This is very comparable to the other solutions that are out there. So I just need 500 neurons, 25,000 synapses, each synapse being 8 bits. What we do is, I'll show you the demo, but basically there's a PC mic, and we have our own ADC that takes the digitized voice to the chip, and then the DSP extracts spectrograms from the voice data, and then off we go in terms of the spike, so spectrogram, which is encoded in the form of spikes. Then off we go trying to use our recurrent model, asynchronous hardware, and ideas of balanced SNNs to train the system. The bottom line here is that we just require 4 kilobytes of programs for the program memory, and the DSP and SNN consumes 32 kilobytes. And we can run this as 2 milliwatts, basically. So let me play this video. So this is basically the continuous speech recognition problem. So the main point here is the Google data set. Each instance of the word was uttered for 1 second, just one word, like 1 or 0 or whatever. That's 1 second. And what we're trying to do here is stitch together a bunch of these words and try to recognize what they are. So this is a little more trickier than, there's no segmentation really, and so we have to deal with that. This hardware that you see here, actually the interface, the signal comes in from the PC mic through this board here, and all this extra bells and whistles you really don't care about. That's the chip that we actually run our stuff on. There's a DSP out here, and that's basically running the filtering or the pre-processing. So we're trying to offer an end-to-end solution, not just saying, oh, it's somebody else's problem to bring the data to the right format for the chip to learn. We want to do everything. We want to take the data and raw data and then process the whole thing, the entire stack, basically. So let me now run it. So we're just going to
3, 4.
Can't hear anything.
5, 6, 7, 8.
Can you jack up the volume a little bit? That's uttered, grabbed by the mic, and then the system just produces its response right there.
7, 8.
So in a crowded scenario, doing the same thing there.
3, 4.
So that's the answer there. And then longer sequences
3,
where things start getting squished.
6, 7.
And so on. So there's a whole bunch of demos we have set up, and we're actually showing this to folks as we go along here. So since yesterday we talked about, people talked about MNIST, and it's a classic benchmark. We obviously threw this same idea onto that to see what it does. And so we just need exactly the same network, 500 neurons with 25,000 synapses, 8 bits per synapse. And here we, instead of having the spectrogram transferred into the chip, we have an image that is transferred into the chip using a DSP to pre-process the MNIST into the right format, and we encode them into spikes. And here's the confusion matrix for the 10,000 images in the MNIST test set. And the numbers look very similar to what you saw before. 4 kilobytes, about 60 kilobytes of memory here because it's an image, and power is about 1 milliwatt. So let me run this video. So you just have a screen, you just scribe whatever you want, and it would tell you what it thinks it is, and you can go on and on. So remember, this is not a scene in the test set because you're just writing it. There's lots of variations. In fact, you'll find that there's a lot of things you can do to mess this up. So basically, essentially, my point here was just drawing inspiration from some features in biology that we know about, and being able to architect a chip that allows us to do this very efficiently seems to suggest that there is a possibility, at least, that we could push this to the edge, so to speak. So the devices that we carry, the sensors and the nodes that are showing up, and billions of these going to show up in the future, there's a potential there for some of these technology to filter into that space where we can exploit what we learn from neurobiology and neuroscience and shows up in electronics that actually does something useful. So with that, I'll just summarize my talk here. So this brain evolved to strike this balance between information processing and energy consumption. These are the 4 pillars around which our system is set up: spiking neural models, asynchronous computing, analog signal processing, and hardware architecture, variations that are derived from what we saw in biology or what we see in biology. Asynchrony in computing seems to be a very important requirement or for getting that efficiency. And furthermore, our innovation allows us to dial down the voltage. And if you have spiking models, that makes it even better because our operating rates are much lower. And so that seems to be a key principle. Spiking neural models with plasticity and this analog signal processing allows us to do this end-to-end solution at the edge. And we believe that that's a very important factor coming in, because any comparison you make has to cover the end-to-end part of it. Otherwise, if it's somebody else's problem to solve part of the pre-filtering or the retinal problem versus the cortex problem, that's a whole other ballgame. Several applications are being tested, and it seems to hold promise for the edge. With that, I will stop on time and be happy to take questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you tell us any more about the neurons and the synapses?
Yeah. So it's the basic integrated, leaky integrated, and fire neurons. The synapses are 8-bit synapses. It's software programmable, so right now it's just the ones that have a trace, basically a synaptic trace, and you can modulate trace based on the timing of the pulses.
So this is actually conventional hardware running a program that emulates spiking neurons.
Right. So we haven't even touched the part where the engineering of the circuits to actually mimic that is not. So what I'm saying is, even without that, just exploiting asynchrony at the level where so right now it's too early to sort of, we all know that, we don't know the answers, all the answers, right? So rather than peg ourselves into some particular model, we want the option of being flexible and being able to program it in. And it seems like there are some principles that work very nicely with this kind of approach. So, yeah. Yeah.
Can you say something about the learning method? I assume it's a recurrent spike neural network, so it's a highly non-trivial to get this network to do anything useful.
Correct. So if you notice in the MNIST case, so what we did was, so we mimic a saccade. So we just go left to right, top to bottom, generate sequences of spikes, where the spike is basically changes in information along each line. So if I go along a line, if there's a transition between dark and white, there's a pulse. Otherwise, it keeps quiet. And then again, the other way around. So the positive and negative spikes for each row. So I get a sequence of those spikes, a sequence of these spikes. And then we just rotate the image once, 45, and another 45, as if I'm saccading, looking at the object this way or that way. And I generate the same sequences. And that's my input flow into the system. That's the input part of it. Now, in terms of the learning itself, so we have plasticity both in the excitatory synapses as well as the inhibitory synapses, meaning that we want to dynamically control the balance in the currents rather than worry about an imbalance. So the plasticity in the synapses are for both. So they sort of keep the control on, so that the number of spikes that are generated by the system is very low. It's very sparse. And then furthermore, the decoding, we use something like a tempotron, or the variation of a tempotron, to classify, so to speak, what the answer is. Yeah.
It's a great talk.
Thank you.
In the mammalian brain, there are all kinds of different spike codes, and so I'm just wondering if these would violate your principles, because the box you get might confer such a survival advantage on the animal that you would be willing to pay more for it.
True. So yeah, I don't make a claim that this is the answer. I'm just saying that you're right. Absolutely, there are many codes. You're right. Absolutely, as we all know. And we're talking about latency code here. So the timing between the pulses is where the signal is encoded. And so what I'm trying to say is, if you have that mode of operation where you have a delicate balance in the currents, then you get a very sparse activity. But you can learn very well as well. So you can really learn well even with the sparse activity. And furthermore, because of the hardware, running it at low frequencies means it gives me the option to dial down the voltage. So I can just go down to 0.2 volts, and that gives me a huge advantage. So that's...
I'm sure you've been showered with all these oscillations in the brain as well, and how the frequencies at different scales mean different things. I wonder if that leaked into your thinking yet?
No. So we are still in the edge world, right? The edge world, you have very limited memory. You have the size, weight, area, power constraints, and now they're throwing latency. They're throwing all these other requirements as well. So we're talking about a much smaller, things that have to work in a very small footprint with very small area. So it's a very different set of constraints. Think of it as Beatles, or more like rather than worrying about. But we're going to write software programs to sort of figure out, maybe over time, maybe working with other folks to see, well, is there a potential to scale up this thing? And what is that? That's something to be done. Yeah.
So you described your system as asynchronous, but you still talked about some global frequency, like a global clock. Could you explain what's going on?
No. So sorry. So the ARM core is synchronous. We know that, right? It's an ARM core. You can buy it off the shelf. But what we have done to it is we have built some bridges that allows us to do complete asynchrony in the processing, ARM processor. So you can write code for C code that runs asynchronously on the ARM core. So that's our innovation. So basically, we're not slaves to the global clock anymore. And this is for the core as well as the DSP. So all of a sudden, I get the retinal stuff as well as the processing stuff asynchronous. Okay, so that's the key. And so once we do that, we're finding that in fact that dominates everything else. The choice of the model, things like that. But what works also matters. Something has to work. It has to do what I just showed you, right? That's the other problem, of course. Modeling is probably most of the problem. But then in terms of hardware, what we find is that seems to be a big principle that we have to sort of exploit in order to do well, keep the energy low, which is important for the edge.
And so what is the factor of what your effective clock is with respect to the ARM clock?
So ARM, so we can run peak rates of 60 megahertz. I mentioned that. But at 60 megahertz, we consume 2 milliwatts. Okay, so ARM can probably quadruple that, right? But then they consume hundreds of milliwatts. So about 400 to 500 milliwatts. So we're a huge factor of 100 better comparatively speaking. And furthermore, if you want to run, more complex problems, you may end up requiring a higher bandwidth. But with spikes, it seems that you can sort of play with that too. So you can sort of, your signals can be, your visual signals are 30 hertz to 60 hertz, right, that come into the camera. Let's say double it, let's say quadruple it. It still doesn't matter in terms of frequency. Your auditory signals are in the kilohertz range. So, we're talking 60 megahertz. So there's a box to play in, basically. And we're playing in that box to see what can be leveraged at the edge. So that's the idea.
So, last question.
Yeah.
Can you please share with us something about the topology of the network?
Sure.
Is it random?
Yeah. So we use, So maybe I can talk to you offline because so there is a. So rather than doing a random graph, so what we do is we ensure that there's some orthogonal properties for the weight vector that we use to initialize the graph. And furthermore, this plasticity in the synapses allows us to keep the current always balanced. So it continuously, I've written this stuff in PLO's Computational Biology 20. I can send you the link to that. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah, thanks a lot. Sorry.